Russian forces have carried out airstrikes on at least 5 railway stations across central and western Ukraine. Officials say at least 5 people have been killed and many more injured. Kyiv says that Russia is deliberately targeting critical infrastructure. In the besieged port city of Mariupol, Ukraine says that efforts to establish humanitarian corridors to evacuate trapped civilians have failed. That is despite claims from Moscow that troops would cease hostilities in the Azovastal steelworks plant, where many people and resistance forces remain. Russia says Ukraine should show readiness to evacuate civilians by raising white flags, but Deputy Prime Minister Irina Vereshchuk insisted the unilaterally announced corridor does not provide security. Meanwhile, the US says it wants to see Russia weakened following high-level talks in Kyiv. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin met with President Volodymyr Zelensky on Sunday to discuss further aid for Ukraine. Austin says Ukraine can win with the right support and equipment. Washington has agreed to send another €300 million military aid package to Kyiv. Blinken says Russian forces in Ukraine are dramatically underperforming and that its economy is in shambles amid Western sanctions.
In terms of Russia's war aims, Russia has already failed and Ukraine has already succeeded because the principal aim that President Putin brought to this, in his own words, was to fully subsume Ukraine back into Russia, to take away its sovereignty and independence. And that has not happened and clearly will not happen.
Well, bringing us the very latest developments from Ukraine is our correspondent Sasha Vakulina, who joins me now. Sasha, good to see you. We heard from Antony Blinken as well as Lloyd Austin on that visit in Kyiv that, well, essentially they want to see Russia militarily weakened. How is this visit playing out in Kyiv? How's it being viewed?
This is a very strong comment, right, from an official coming this way. Blinken also said that a strategy of a massive support for Ukraine, massive pressure against Russia. This is what the US has been doing, and this is what he expects from all the NATO members. One day before that, on Saturday, giving the press conference, Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine is not the country for tragic and sad selfies. So the visits that are coming from politicians, from the allies, should bring the support as well. They should have something on the table. And this is what we saw from the US officials visiting Kyiv over the weekend. Since the beginning of this war, since the 24th of February, the US supplied more than $3.7 billion worth of arms to Kyiv. And with all these news and the lines that they will keep adding that and will keep adjusting that help and that support, the US has to make this statement about the continuous support that they are providing to Ukraine and that they will provide. Now, the other question, of course, will go to the other NATO members, specifically Germany. Germany has been criticized quite a lot recently about its not willingness or not readiness to provide arms and weapons to Ukraine. And we do know that Lloyd Austin will travel next to Germany, where some of these issues will be on the table to be discussed among the NATO ministers.
Definitely a strong quote there from President Zelensky saying Ukraine is not your country for sad selfies. Nevertheless, in places like Mariupol, for example, the situation does remain dire. Not everyone is out. We also know that Azovastal hasn't been fully evacuated. Russia saying that it's agreed to a ceasefire there. But Ukraine doesn't really see it that way, does it?
There was a completely unilateral statement from Russia today when Russian forces says that from 2 o'clock in the afternoon there will be a humanitarian corridor that would be open for Azovstal. Now, Kyiv responded saying that they were not advised on that. They did not discuss it. This is not the humanitarian corridor that was agreed upon. And the Deputy Prime Minister, Irina Vereshchuk, who is normally in charge of the humanitarian corridor, she said, look, she was ready to do so much as possible to secure that humanitarian corridor, but without the proper guarantees, the way it should be done, this cannot be considered as a humanitarian corridor. Therefore, she also asked she wanted Moscow to provide written security guarantees to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres that the humanitarian corridor has to be open with all the sides agreeing on that, and that was not the case today. Also, over Easter Sunday, Orthodox Easter Sunday, according to Mariupol authorities, around 150 people were taken from Mariupol to Russia.
Meanwhile, the situation in the east goes on, the onslaught there and the fighting, attacks on railway stations in central Ukraine and the west as well. Is this an escalation?
There is an escalation. This is also a sign that Russia is increasingly focusing on stations, on train stations and railway, because we've seen that started a few weeks ago with the attack in Kramatorsk, where people were evacuating and waiting for those trains with 50 people tight there in Kramatorsk, and now what's been happening here, of course, look, nowadays rails and trains, this is the safest way to evacuate for the civilians from all over Ukraine, and also this is the safest way to bring in supplies and the weapons to the other parts of Ukraine, and this is why we can see this more and more focus on targeting the train stations and the railways there. Fighting continues all over Ukraine. It has not stopped in the east, with heavy bombardment as well in Kharkiv, with Odessa strike over the weekend. This is southern Ukraine. This goes with the lines that we've heard from Russia last week, when they said the next stage of this war, they will be focusing also on securing the southern corridor, taking over eastern and southern part of Ukraine to get the access to Transnistria and Moldova.